for people that aren't fully aware of the story, what actually happened behind the scenes in the boardrooms, in those dealings that have got Chelsea into trouble?
Well, in a nutshell, at least 36 times between 2011 and 2018, Chelsea made off-book payments, i.e. payments that were made outside of Chelsea Football Club for the benefit of Chelsea Football Club to agents, players, coaches and scouts, totaling £47.5 million.
Right.
Those are the admitted, no dispute. That's what Chelsea told.
So they're buying a player, and on the quiet from a different bank account, they shift the player some cash or the agent some cash, right?
Yeah.
To sweeten the deal.
As we understand it, the players involved were never aware, or certainly was never proved that any of the players were aware of the payments. But we do know that in the case of Hazard, Willian, Schürrle, Louise, i.e. some of the most important players of that Chelsea era, their agents were paid something in the order of 45 million of the 47.5.
Right.
Off the books, into bank accounts, usually in the Cayman Islands or offshore, and they were paid by Abramovich. Nobody knew about the dealings outside of Chelsea. Apparently, the payments were known to the senior executives at Chelsea. We don't know the identities of those individuals, but none of those individuals are still with the club. So the payments were made. The advantage appears to be obvious in that they were used to aid the signing of those players in competition with other teams. We know, for example, Manchester United were offered Hazard if they paid the agent £5 million. They refused to do so, and he went to Chelsea. We know that Willian was, I think, actually in the building at Tottenham, and for reasons that now are clear, or at least partly clear, ended up at Chelsea. So I think there's little doubt that those transactions created a sporting advantage for Chelsea at that time. And we don't need to debate whether they happened. As I say, all of this has now been admitted by Chelsea's new owners. It was described by the Premier League as obvious and deliberate breaches of the rules that involved deception and effectively, in other words, they are fraudulent transactions within football over a very long period, systematic over a 7-year period in the early 2010s.
And it's very interesting, this, because I've seen a lot of the conversation around Chelsea saying this helped Chelsea sign better players, which is absolutely right? But I haven't seen many people saying, well, it prevented Manchester United from getting Hazard. It prevented Tottenham getting Willian. So it's a bit like playing a 6-pointer with a team next to you in the table. You know, not only did Chelsea benefit, but the other teams were kind of handicapped by this.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether the punishment, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is around £10 million.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It is.
It doesn't feel to me like a huge punishment for the crime. And
correct.
I wonder whether it's a punishment that's enough to kind of preserve trust between football and football fans.
Well, look, it's not just the absolute amount. It's the contrast between the amount that's they've been fined and the other cases that appear to have similar elements to them, particularly when it comes to the counterfactual of what would have happened had they not signed those players. It's obvious, to be perfectly honest, that Chelsea had a sporting advantage from these signings. Everton had a sporting advantage from breaching PSR. Nottingham Forest had a sporting advantage from their breach of PSR. And therefore, all of the situations deserve a sporting sanction if those are the rules. And the cases with Everton and Nottingham Forest seem to establish, on the face of quite lengthy deliberations and judgments, also over appeals, that if you have a sporting advantage, you have a sporting penalty. And then we come back to Chelsea and it's a £10 million fine. And it gets better because they're not even paying it, because the structure of the deal when Chelsea were acquired in the rushed process around the Abramovich sanctions led to £150 million being reserved for warranty claims and indemnity claims, i.e. things that were found subsequently that cause a loss to the buyer.
And that's money put up by the new owners?
No, it's reserved from the consideration for the deal.
Right.
So 150 of the 2.5 billion was left in a law firm's escrow account pending resolution of potential claims and other matters that they may find in the period after the acquisition, where losses may accrue from things that were done before they acquired it. So this being a perfect example, the misdemeanors of the Abramovich era cost 10 million euros from the UEFA fine, now 10 million pounds from the Premier League fine. We understand from some of the reporting, particularly in the Times on this point, that it's going to be a similar fine from the FA. Again, no suggestion of a sporting sanction. All of those penalties and fines all come out of the escrow account, which ultimately means the escrow retention, this £150 million, that ultimately, if there are not claims against it, to the extent that money's left over, will be transferred back into the pot that will be transferred to the Ukrainian charity at some point. But if you do the maths on that, what that means is every penny that comes out of this pot is £1 less for the Ukrainian charities.
Yes.
So ultimately, it's not even Blueco and Chelsea who have paid the £10 million fine. So not only is it in the context of other cases, apparently a very low absolute figure, and the Premier League will argue it's the largest ever penalty that they've ever fined a club. And that's true on the face of it, although the one that they pointed to was West Ham in 2007, which was 5.5 million. But of course, if you index link 5.5 million from 2007, it's actually barely even the biggest fine, even on that basis. And by the way, Manchester City got fined £1 million by the Premier League just for coming out late at half time a year ago. So in the grand scheme of things, £10 million that Chelsea are not even going to end up paying does not appear on the face of it to be a proportionate penalty for what appears to be very serious matters of deliberate sporting advantage.
And if we're saying that it looks like this money is coming from money that would otherwise go to a Ukrainian charity, another way of explaining that is to say that effectively a Ukrainian charity are funding this payment. That leaves a really sour taste in the mouth of someone like me who's a football fan.
Yeah. Look, people will say that you're sort of twisting the facts and you're making these links that don't really exist. I'm afraid that is the reality. Ultimately, the way we understand that deal was done is that net proceeds of the sale of Chelsea were to go to a Ukrainian charity set up by Abramovich as part of the deal to allow the whole transaction to go through. We understand right now that if that money does not go to the charity, the UK government are going to take legal action against Abramovich. So there can be no question that the money that we're talking about here ultimately is intended to end up in a charity's pocket. And clearly, if that number is eroded by fines from the leagues and UEFA, then clearly there's less money that ends up in their pockets. It's very hard to argue that that's an unfair way of looking at it. And it's very hard to say that that doesn't leave a sour taste in the mouth.
Yeah. When you sort of break this down and you think that Chelsea have got a squad worth about £1.5 billion, one of, if not the most expensive squad ever established in the Premier League, the fact there's £150 million set aside to pay off any claims, of which only around 30 million we think is what...
Yeah, we don't know the total amount. Yeah. I mean, those are the ones that we know definitively.
Yeah.
Well, we know about two of them definitively. The FA one we still don't know.
Yeah.
But likewise, if it turns out, just to make it even more painful, if it turns out that...
when you find something that just fits right into your routine and you think, why was I not doing this sooner? Well, that's how I felt when I first came across the Bond Charge infrared sauna blanket. Now, if you follow me on my socials, I'm a pretty big fan of saunas. But I also know that sometimes they're just not the most accessible things. I mean, I travel a lot, for example. The infrared sauna blanket, though, well, for me, it solves that problem. I mean, it heats up in under a minute. It can be used on your sofa or wherever you relax. You can take it with you if you're traveling. I love the fact that it uses an infrared heat to target your body directly. So there's no sweating buckets, there's no discomfort. It's this lovely sort of smooth, effective way to burn calories, to detox, to relax. And you know, Bon Charge have built a loyal following of over 250,000 happy customers, including me. And when you're talking about something that gets those kinds of results, I think it's important to listen. So if you're looking for a way to make your recovery easier, a bit less of a chore, then maybe check out Bon Charge. Head to boncharge.com and use the code HP15 to save 15%. That's the code HP15 for 15% off at boncharge.com. Trust me, it's worth a look.
They get actually a points deduction from the FA. Let's say 6 points. And let's say that 6 points is the difference between Chelsea qualifying for the Champions League and not qualifying for any European competition. There's a very good chance that Chelsea and Blueco, as the buyer of Chelsea, will be able to make a claim against the pot that we talked about, a warranty claim for the loss that's occurred from the points deduction from the matters that are historic. So it could be even worse. So, because in that scenario, Chelsea will have a very strong argument for, let's say, £100 million loss between what they would have got by being in the Champions League and what they will now receive by having the points deduction. So it could get worse. That pot could be extinguished completely. And then on top of that, there may well be other claims that we don't know about.
And you've mentioned Nottingham Forest and Everton in this same conversation. For those that are not aware of what PSR is, would you just explain PSR?
Yeah, PSR is a 3-year rolling limit to what you can lose.
And PSR stands for?
Profit and Sustainability Rules.
Okay, so they both got points deductions. They got sporting sanctions. Do we know why it was such a different outcome for Chelsea?
I would say it's partly to do with a poor process and a wrong decision. Now, the Premier League would not agree with that. Yeah. My analysis of it was that there was insufficient consideration of sporting advantage caused by something other than PSR. So if you were to read the 28 pages in the Chelsea decision, it's not quite a decision in the same terms as something that flows from a disciplinary process, because it's called a sanction agreement. So it's more an agreement of what happened as opposed to the outcome of a litigious process. But if you were to read the 28 pages of that sanction agreement, you'll see that the Premier League spent a long time focusing on two aspects. One, was there a breach of PSR, even if we add back the £47.5 million? And they concluded, with various modelling, that even if you add back the 47 million as a cost, reduce their profits by 47 million over that period, they still would never have breached PSR during the period, and therefore they can't punish them for a breach of PSR.
Is there an argument that one of the reasons why the punishment feels lenient is because at the time that these breaches happened, Chelsea had a different owner?
Well, that's in there. That is in the sanction agreement as being a factor. And I think we would all accept that it can be a mitigating factor. I don't think anybody that reads that 28 pages will argue that these are factors that should be taken into account. What the issue really is the weight that has been given to these things. So if I'm a business in the outside world and I am a new management team, and I've been in that situation myself where I've become chief executive of a company that was under investigation for the actions of the previous management. And we were under investigation from the Serious Fraud Office. And what doesn't happen is the Serious Fraud Office go, oh yeah, well, that management team's gone, so of course there's nothing to see here. But that's not the way it works. It's a factor in the discussion. It may mean that ultimately you're in a position where you get a more lenient treatment. It may mean that the focus of the investigation is on people who have left the organisation. But ultimately, the company, in this case, Chelsea Football Club, they are still the entity that carried out these actions. that carried out this deliberate, wholesale, concealed action in respect of signing footballers against the rules. You can't split those two things. You can give them some credit because they're no longer owned by the same people, but it's not an absolution. It's not an end of nothing to see here type scenario, and it shouldn't be something that gets the party a cleansing of the past. In the same way that if tomorrow Manchester City were to say, Sheikh Mansour says, I've decided to sell City, we've just done the deal, we've sold them to some private equity house in the US, nobody would expect that everybody would go, oh, well, what if we can forget 115, guys, we can put that to bed now. Of course not. You would say, well, that's irrelevant. We still want to see what happened in respect of the Manchester City case. They're still responsible for the actions that were taken in the past. And that's a fundamental of these sorts of processes and law, and it's mitigation, and it should not be something that's overplayed.
And does the ruling that we've seen regarding Chelsea recently have any bearing on what you think the result is going to be in the Manchester City case?
I think Manchester City are going to look at it very carefully and go, that is interesting. That if you were to read between the lines in the Chelsea situation, and I do emphasize that it is a settlement and a sanction agreement versus something that's come from, in the City case, a 12-week adversarial hearing. They're not the same. And of course, City, according to the Premier League, have not cooperated in the slightest and have not admitted anything.
Yeah.
And so there are clearly very big differences in those respects from the mitigation perspective. But it does say in the Chelsea sanction hearing that had there not been this exceptional cooperation from Chelsea, they would not have had a 50% reduction of the financial penalty. What it doesn't say is that had they not cooperated, there'd have been an enormous sporting sanction.
Yeah.
It actually seems to point towards a situation where if you don't breach PSR, the profit and sustainability rules, then, well, it's not great, but it's not as serious as the Everton and Nottingham Forest cases, and we may be able to just treat you with a financial penalty and all move on like nothing happened. Now, I mean, that is obviously a stretch of the Chelsea decision, but certainly there are elements in that Chelsea sanction agreement that push towards leniency and will be an authority for some of the arguments that may come up if Manchester City are found to have breached certain of these rules relating to a similar period.
Did you say some of these top clubs are unsellable? Did I see that?
Yeah, so I think it's all part of the same. It's all part of the same equation. It's all fun, but if you're trying to make a return and you're coming in and you're in price, so let's say the Chelsea situation, you're in price now with everything that they've invested over time is probably, let's say, £3.5 billion. Where's the return, right? They're already 4 years into the project. They've done okay. They've won the Club World Cup. They've won a conference. They've got some quality players, but generally there's more investment that needs to be made. They've made no progress at all on the stadium. And that's just an enormous project if they ever want to do it. Multi-billion-dollar project for those Americans, and we're going into a high interest rate environment, potentially. It's a huge problem. So how do they ever get a return from here? So if you were buying it partly for return, partly for fun, partly because it was going to open doors, well, it's opened loads of the doors. So that's kind of box ticked. You've had your fun. You've been there, you've seen it, you've understood the industry, you've had a bit of success. You could say half ticked. Where's your return? Very hard to see. Tottenham Hotspur, similar sort of problem. They've got an asset worth, let's say, £3 billion in their minds, but who's going to buy it? The reason that we got onto the unsellable risk is just that the game is so successful in the Premier League. It means the enterprise values of the top clubs is now so high that there's just so few buyers. They almost can't be bought by one individual. If you're buying a football club for 4 or 5 billion quid. You've got to be worth 20 times that. You've got to be somebody worth 100 billion pounds. Well, we know that the only people worth 100 billion pounds are a small group of American,
Musk and Bezos and a few mates,
and the guys out of the Middle East potentially before the latest situation in the war. And of course, Newcastle are already owned by Saudi through PIF. City have got strong links with Abu Dhabi, shall we say, and that doesn't leave that many other potential buyers. So how Premier League clubs now get sold at the top of the table is going to be an interesting sort of challenge for them once they've ticked their boxes of ownership. Once they've had their fun. And that's going to be a big issue with a club like Chelsea right now, where you're starting to get fan protests of sell. You've got to sell. Who are they going to sell it to?
Yeah.
The Glazers. Who are the Glazers going to sell it to?